welcome again to those of you who have been following our series in Islam after colonialism, co-sponsored by the University of Exeter and Habib University. My name is Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Liberal Studies over here. I'll just start by saying something about the title of the series for those of you who are coming here for the first time. Islam after colonialism necessarily assumes that there was a great transformation that took place under colonialism, and not just colonialism. That transformation continued in the post-colonial period, or the period after formal decolonization. And yes, indeed, there was such an extraordinary transformation, as lots of scholarship over the past several decades has illuminated. Islam after colonialism not only discusses that transformation, but also gives us glimpses of what there was in the past, there's a necessary gesture to the before when you say after. So we've had some of those, and today I think we'll combine both of these elements as well as the other part of this, which is gesturing towards something as the post-colonial, for instance, also gestures towards the possible future and a hope that in fact we will have at some point decolonized, a task that is really before us. So with that brief introduction, my colleague, Dr. Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter will introduce our eminent speaker for today. Sajjad.
Thank you, Nauman. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Ebrahim Moosa, who is the Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies at the University of Notre Dame. A number of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with Ebrahim's work. I think I first came across his work when I read his book on Ghazali, and actually I reviewed it about 15 years ago, I think it was, or something like that. And in many ways, that book already kind of signals some of the things which I suspect we will talk about, which is, how do we make sense of this particular heritage, this kind of liminal heritage of Islamic thought in the past? What utility does it have for people, for current contemporary Muslims thinking about these sorts of issues? And how do we bring that intellectual heritage in conversation with the different kinds of theoretical and intellectual challenges and ideas that we face from philosophy, from other fields in the humanities? And then, of course, that work also developed with his more recent work, which is called What is a Madrasa, which is partly a historical stroke normative study of this particular notion of an educational institution and its significance in the world of Islam. But in a sense, it also signals the question of what it might be. And increasingly, I think a lot of us who are engaged in Islamic thought are also concerned with how it is that some of these institutions and perhaps informal institutions, how do they develop and move forward? What might the seminary, the madrasa, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, what might it actually look like? What sort of priorities should it have? How should it be training people? What is the nature of that training, and so forth? And what, of course, what significant social and political role do those institutions have in our futures as well? So we can say a lot more about Ebrahim's work. I've known him for a number of years, a wonderfully interesting interlocutor and friend, and someone who, one last thing I will say is that, we're interested also in doing this series because we want to take thought out there. The fact of the matter is we're doing this on Facebook. This is not just a very limited set of seminars for a limited academic audience. We hope that actually there are people who are not academics who are also interested in these questions. So we really want to take thought and praxis out into the world, out into societies, and we very much invite that engagement and response and feedback from all of those who might be watching this out there. So I think that's probably enough for me to say. For that, this is in that context, I think Ebrahim is a wonderful person to be presenting it, and hopefully we will also be talking about some of the actual projects he's been working on, which are about connecting dots, connecting different people's thought worlds, ideas and practices that are of relevance to this world of Islam after colonialism. So without any more from me, please, Professor Ebrahim Moosa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rizvi and Professor Rizvi and Professor Nauman Naqvi. Thank you for this invitation. It's great to meet Professor Naqvi in virtually, and Sajjad, we saw each other a couple of years ago in London, although we've been in contact in a variety of ways. So thank you. It's great to be part of the Exeter community and network that you have. And so, you know, when you forced me to, I'm only kidding, you didn't force me, but when you invited me so generously and say, you know, do something that you have been thinking about and work that you're relevant, don't do anything new, I thought that, you know, I'll give the pretext for this appearance as, you know, contestations of between kind of post-colonial in the post-colony rather, in this question of contestations in knowledge traditions among different Muslim groups on the subcontinent. So obviously there's also this whole question of the post-colony, and this whole question that is now trying to push the post-colony to ask different kinds of questions, is the question of decolonial, which is also part of some of the kind of the threads of your series. So let me start by saying, you know, how do I get here? How do I get to Ghazali, and how do I get to the madrasa, right? Because in many ways, I find my meditations and thinking on Islamic thought largely biographical, if not autobiographical, and all history is in some ways related to the question of the self and who you are and what you are and where you are going to go, you know, and what is the good life, you know, how does one live the good life? And so it starts from a very early age, growing up in apartheid South Africa, where I'm not entirely sure who am I. I'm, you know, born in a Muslim Gujarati family. They are traders. There's no idea of aspiration of going to universities and so on. Although my generation began to think, yes, there's something that, you know, if you don't want to go into family business, you have to do something with yourself. And I come across, as I put in the book, What is a Madrasa? I come across a colleague at the school, at high school, asking me questions about Islam and the Prophet Muhammad and making all kinds of allegations, and about Islam being a false religion, the Prophet Muhammad being a false prophet. And these questions make me start thinking about these kind of questions. You know, who am I? What am I? Is this faith that I'm holding on to be true? And the quick way to cut a long story short is there's the local Tabligh Jamaat who is at the mosque that I do attend, but I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing at the mosque. They give me some kind of emotional solace, but it doesn't answer the intellectual questions about, you know, how does one have a law that was developed in the 7th century where they amputate hands, and people who are engaged in certain kind of moral and other kinds of offenses, they have their, you know, necks cut off or beheaded, or they get punished by death. Now, I grew up in a country in South Africa where death was all around me. Black people are being killed all the time by apartheid police. They did have the death penalty, so people would be killed all the time. But this idea that a faith tradition also advocates something that, to my very juvenile sensibilities, sounded fairly harsh, okay? And I didn't have much knowledge about Islam. That set me off and say, I need to go and study Islam at a place where I can answer, a place where these nagging questions can be answered. And through the Tabligh movement, I realized that India is a destination. Actually, it was originally meant to be Pakistan is the destination to go and study at the madrasa. Why didn't I go to the Arab world, many people would say, is because in the city of Cape Town, where I grew up in, there were a number of Arab trained ulama, but in the Tabligh movement saw them as being less devoted. They wore Western clothes. They had their beards trimmed as mine, and they were not, complying to the kind of the various paraphernalia and the kind of devout formation as the Tabligh Jamaat advocated. Today, I'll have to eat my words when I say that, what I used to say more than 4 decades ago. But that was the impressionistic idea I had, that South Asia has authenticity. So authenticity is the attraction of the madrasa. But that was a very juvenile understanding of authenticity, insofar as that I thought of authenticity as exterior things, right? It's about the beard and clothing, and a devotion to Islam also was part of authenticity. But what is authenticity is still a question I'm trying to figure out. So when I get to South Asia, obviously my eyes open up. India, the Pakistan thing doesn't work out. Some of my friends go to Pakistan. I end up in India. I begin experimenting with different madrasas. I go from a regional madrasa in Gujarat to Deoband, and both of those places do not really quench my intellectual thirst. I finally end up at Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, where the famous scholar Abu Hassan Ali Nadwi used to be the head of the institution, the equivalent of, say, the vice chancellor or the principal of the institution. And so going to a big city such as Lucknow from the small kind of Qasba, a small town of Deoband, uh, exposed me to a range of possibilities. There was, like, next door to me was Lucknow University. I'm now in a big city. I frequent the British Library. I'm now reading. You must remember, I left South Africa at age 17 and a half, 18. I didn't go to college. This is my first exposure. So after 1 or 2 years learning foundational Arabic and Urdu, now I'm beginning to grapple with the madrasa tradition. And obviously, when I leave India, after 6 years there, I go into journalism. I go to London, work for Arabia Magazine. My basic idea was, this was a good experience, but I don't think, well, everything I studied doesn't hang together, doesn't really make sense. Doesn't really make sense. And I'm not sure what it is, but, I fought with my entire family uh, to leave South Africa and not go to university. I managed, my aunts persuaded my father to let me go. I finished the curriculum there. I'm now kind of labeled an alim, but I'm not sure what this is all about. In London, I frequent the School of Oriental African Studies library because it was near where I was working. And I come across an author by the name of Fazlur Rahman that I never heard of. And I read Islam. When I read Islam, the book, I said, wow, this man knows everything I was taught, but he can put it into a framework. Now, slowly, the big picture comes forward. The big picture appears, that what I didn't get in a madrasa, the madrasa doesn't pay attention to history, doesn't give you the big picture. You learn all about Imam Abu Hanifa, about Shafi, you learn about Al-Ash'ari, you learn about it's a very, as Fazl Rahman is right, it's presented to you in an atomistic way. But the kind of big picture doesn't come together. Fast forward, I leave the UK, go to South Africa, and when I go to South Africa, I'm thrown deep into an anti-apartheid struggle, and Muslims are trying to think about the questions of justice and freedom and majority rule. And myself, people like Farid Ishaq and others, we are now up against the ulama who are saying that these people are, the majority are non-Muslims. Muslims must preserve themselves. There are all kinds of fatwa for Muslim self-preservation, but how to deal with the democratic South African question is something that I wrote about when I was in London. I laid out the landscape in Arabia Magazine, the landscape for Muslims and the challenges that they had in South Africa. And therefore, a number of people, when I got back to South Africa, they started inviting me, you need to talk about the national liberation question. So it's now the national liberation question, this background that I have brings me back to my text of the madrasa. Now I'm not only reading, Maududi and Sayyid Qutb, but I'm now going back to tafsir, to ilm al-kalam, to those things that I thought did not have great value Now I'm returning to the madrasa, but now dressed differently, but also intellectually equipped differently. And this continues to my going to University of Cape Town, doing a master's and PhD degree in religious studies, and that raises a number of questions. So what is it that I struggle with? So when I, 9/11 happens, the madrasas become, long story short, I had moved to the United States in 1998 at Duke, and first Stanford for 3 years as a visiting professor, then Duke for about 13 years. And in 2014, I moved to University of Notre Dame. So the madrasas are kind of blackballed in the United States as the people, the occupants of it are the denizens of terrorism, and also these are terrorist, kind of warehouses. And basically, I wanted to write a book to explain to the world what the madrasas are all about. The question that I go with to researchers in India and Pakistan, and go back to walk back in the footsteps that I walked many decades ago, is what I've discovered is that the knowledge traditions that the madrasas provide are great. It links me to my heritage, but that heritage does not, in many ways, deal with the modern state, doesn't deal with a self. They call it a modern self. Look, let's use the word modern as a placeholder. What is the modern is sometimes overdone, but it's a different world. It's a different world. We're in a stage of post-empire, but imperial epistemologies are still flourishing, and they are through Western education, other modes of existence. And those modes of existence of the colonial heritage, in variety of ways, dominate and shape the societies in which Muslims find themselves. They are faced with questions of human rights. In South Africa, we're faced with the questions of national liberation. We have questions about gender rights, and how do we deal with that? How do we deal with questions of citizenship as a Muslim minority in a country like South Africa? And the answers that Muslims are finding are all contained within a tradition, sure, but that tradition doesn't fully speak to the lived reality of Muslims. So my big kind of existential question is that how do I live my tradition and my temporality? It's about tradition and temporality. It's about tradition, which in many ways is also organized by time in some ways, but is also, timeless in many aspects. But there's also the question of time and temporality. And time and temporality was that juvenile question of mine about laws and rules and regulations and practices that are connected to certain and different sociological and anthropological spaces. And what is the place of those kinds of practices in a world in which is now organized differently? So this question of epistemology runs through the Ghazali book, where I'm very, very, quietly and also respectfully trying to raise some questions in conversation with Ghazali, about the questions about the self, about epistemology, about what are the allowable questions and what are the not allowable questions. Ghazali's fight with the philosophers. He's penalizing people like Ibn Sina and others on three issues, that has a life of its own. But when I go to this to the subcontinent in 2004 and 2005 to research the madrasa book, my question to my teachers and my question to madrasa audiences are, while the book is mostly on kind of the Deoband school, some Barelvi, I also talk to Salafis, I also talk to Shia institutions and so on. My question to them was, you know, the question of knowledge. How do you deal with knowledge of the present in your conversation with tradition? And I swear, most of these people thought I'm asked as a question that they didn't understand, or they answered in that way, the following way. Well, we don't stop people from learning other knowledge. We don't stop. We don't tell people. But I know they discourage people from going to universities. When anyone wants to leave Deoban or Nadwa or Barelvi and want to go and study at Aligarh University, the teachers would say, "Oh, you are getting off a horse and mounting a donkey, is it?" you know. I mean, in other words, and the big fear is that these modern institutions with modern are contaminating or contaminate the Muslim self, the self that the madrasas try to nurture. So the madrasas are places of nurturing of a self, going to a certain kind of formation. But I think it's all now, in my view, given my experience and my recent inquiries, that what the madrasas historically might have been a republic of letters, it had become a republic of piety. It's all about the cultivation of piety, but the cultivation of piety according to a playbook that doesn't always take the knowledge of the present into consideration. In other words, do you need manuals now that is going to deal with the self in a kind of a you know, post-Einsteinian world? A question about a world where, in the world post-Ghazalian, Ibn Taymiyyah, Mullah Sadra universe, where a variety of realities that are shaping us organize and also work on our souls. We are just not entirely connected to this past. So when I raise this question of knowledge, most of them, give this kind of answer. It seems that they don't really understand. Or the other answer would be, we don't have the qualifications to teach math and science. And my question was, no, I'm not asking you to teach math and science. You might want to get a math and science teacher in there to give you some of the elementary understandings of math and science. But what I'm talking about what we call the humanities, in talking about deeper understandings of Arabic literature, Persian literature, deeper understandings and more complex understandings of philosophy. Philosophy is completely neglected in the madrasas. People learn these books, only study 5 pages of the book, and then close it down and learn certain mustalahat, because that language in itself is no longer understandable, and the study and the teaching of Arabic in the madrasas are absolutely horrific. I mean, students get through a 6-year, 8-year, 9-year curriculum by looking at Urdu commentaries. And a senior teacher at Nadwa, which is renowned for the study of Arabic and prides itself, even a professor there told me that, only 1 or 2% of the topmost understand Arabic language well. Okay. Now you're going to find some very, very brilliant graduates there. Those are the graduates that some of them that I've pulled into my Madrasa Discourses project, who know these texts fairly well, and I will pivot to that in a minute. So this question of, what is knowledge, and how does one, I don't like the word reconcile, because it's not about question of conciliation, but it's a question of, in the ways in which, now, people might be critical of the early Muslim philosophers, that they instrumentalize the Greek legacy, because the word instrumentalization today is an ugly word, right? Even if it's a what Gayatri Spivak would call strategic instrumentalization, or a strategic way that you do that, but you're critical that they really don't, there's no organic way. So I think what I'm searching for is an organic way that the Muslim soul and the Muslim self would begin to understand the complexity of human reality. And how do we navigate that complexity is the kind of primary question that I ask in um, in this book. And I cite somewhere Michel Foucault's claim that the desire to know is in its nature already something like knowledge, something belonging to knowledge. So this desire that we have is already there. And what it is, that how to create this framework. The big challenge that I found, is that especially with learning that will deal with the foundation sources of our tradition, the interpretation and the hermeneutics of the Quran and the Sunnah, the conversations regarding ilm al-kalam, theology, usul al-fiqh, legal theory, fiqh in itself, that knowledge coming from the outside would be seen as hugely disruptive, at least for the people in the madrasa sphere. they would say that that knowledge was not produced within a Muslim soul, it's outside the knowledge, right? And so even citing Foucault might not be, what might not serve as hujjah, as proper evidence, especially when people come to know what Foucault's biography is about, right? And then suddenly, why are you now, quoting a man who was openly gay, and Foucault's, it cannot be trusted, because the trust in knowledge has to do with a certain kind of righteousness and a certain kind of conformity to tradition, and the lack of that would result in the discrediting of authority or articulation, or presenting that insight as a valuable insight of hikmah. Now, you could quote to them, Abu Nawaz, who had his own practices and so on and so forth, but Abu Nawaz had great insights into literature and into the human understanding, or Abu Ala al-Ma'arri, that some people might think Ma'arri was, semi-agnostic, or maybe a believer of a different kind, and so on and so forth. But these will be difficult conversations with madrasa communities, to, as I found, because they believe that those knowledge traditions really do not, the contemporary modern knowledge tradition, because they are the product of the West, because they're the product of people outside the Islamic tradition, they need to be vetted. So, for instance, one good example that I always give is someone like Taqi Usmani and so on, a leading scholar, mufti in Pakistan, someone who writes extensively, argues, for instance, that yes, modern knowledge is necessary, but what you need is, you need some very, very good traditional scholars who need to study modern knowledge. Then they need to filter that knowledge to give that knowledge to the students, because there are many, many contaminating aspects in modern knowledge, and the big issue that they are concerned about is the question of doubt. Okay, and people like Nietzsche and others who would sow doubt into the minds of the young and completely demolish faith and so on. So that's a concern. And my pushback and retort to that is that knowledge is messy. But you can't take knowledge. You cannot take knowledge to a laundromat to have it washed and get you can't wash it. What you need is to grapple with both the epistemological questions and also ontologies. Knowledge is connected to the ontological, about being, and being is about existence. And existence is something that you no longer not share with others. Even in the empire where you had majorities and minorities of Muslim empire, um, yes, you could shape the self according to the worldview and vision of the majority. But now you're living in a world that the believers and non-believers, agnostics, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, are sharing similar understandings of the world, the physical universe, similar kind of understanding of the political. And so we are now living in shared spaces, and we're living in shared ontological as well as epistemological spaces. We might have very, very different purposes and outcomes. For some it will be salvation in this world, and in another, for some it will only about human flourishing in this world, but nevertheless we have common purposes. So how does one deal with these issues? These were questions that I don't think that I've managed to make any headway with the madrasa community leadership. What I have since done, and I'm going to pivot to the Madrasa Discourses project, is that on my visits to South Asia, while researching the Madrasa book, I then met with the Islamic Fiqh Academy's Secretary General, a man by the name of Amin Usmani. And Amin Usmani is a very soft-spoken man. He very tragically died recently as a result of COVID, and a big loss for me as a supporter. A man who understood what this was all about. He understood what the burden was, and he kept on telling me, in Urdu, "Ye bahut bada kaam hai." This is a lot of work. I told him, yes, I need you to be around to help me navigate that. So he basically told me, look, people like you who studied in the subcontinent, what about the possibility of you, you know, training and entering into conversation with the next generation of younger ulama in South Asia? And I was at Duke at the time, and as you know how universities are in North America, in the religious studies departments, theology is not not the cool topic to have a conversation because it's seen as confessional. And but when I moved to Notre Dame in 2014, where you can talk about theology openly, you can talk about religion openly, they wanted me here to talk, start a program in the study of Islam. I then, approached the Templeton Foundation, and they were open to the idea that, how do I start a series of conversations with recently graduated madrasa students? And so we have now been very, successful in putting through about 150 of these young graduates, uh, people, both men and women. And I'm very proud to say we've now, over time and through experience, managed to get people from different kind of theological orientations. They are Deobandis, Salafis, Barelvis, Shia, Imamis, a whole range of them, and so on. And while we not very successful in getting women who had studied in the madrasa, maybe one or two, but some of the women who had studied at International Islamic University or Jamia Millia, who have some kind of equipment, because we want to make that possible, that we also draw women into this conversation. So what do we do in the Madrasa Discourses? And one of your previous speakers, Sher Ali, I've roped him into this project, um, is that I had previously, the person who started this off was Mahan Mirza, but he's moved on to do some other things here. So what we basically do is, the 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 project title is revisiting or developing scientific and theological literacy. The scientific and Templeton Foundation is a foundation that is committed to religion and science. So the scientific questions. And so it's not that we're teaching people, how to work in the laboratory. It's more the kind of larger philosophical questions that the scientific worldview generates. Questions such as the human person, questions such as uh, Darwinian evolution, questions such as history and time, the making of our world. We've roped in a whole number of different kind of faculty. Right now, someone is teaching them about astrophysics and so on. So it's basically a 2-year program that we put participants through the questions of science, through the questions of history, and revisiting the text that they had studied in the madrasas by asking different kinds of questions to it, is what we call the elicitive approach. Approach communities, these kind of communities, the communities that I belong to, from the questions that we know, from where we come from where I come from, and make that the platform of asking the questions that now can go a little bit more, but developing a certain kind of confidence that this is not subversive, but rather developmental. It's, you see, one of the biggest kind of fears that madrasa communities have, and that outsiders like myself, I'm myself an insider outsider, possibly more on the outside now, they think of us as subversive. Universities are subversive. The world, the governments in various countries are subversive. They're trying to pull them away from their tradition. So they're very much holding on to that tradition with their teeth. But you have some brave individuals like the ones that we've recruited in India and Pakistan, with the help of my really, really great and extraordinary colleagues, Dr. Waris Mazhari, who's a madrasa graduate from Deoband and who is teaching at Jamia Hamdard, and Maulana Ammar Khan Nasir, who is a scholar who taught at Nusratul Ulum for many years, also taught at Gift University, and now has Ibn Khaldun Institute. And his father is a leading Deobandi scholar. So he's a both of these colleagues are extraordinary instructors and very well grounded in the tradition, but also they know their community. So basically, they are partners in this. I'm just facilitating that. I do teach from time to time, and what we do is we take them for 2 weeks over the summer to a place like Kathmandu, where we bring a whole range of faculty to them to study. We build bridges, and for a week in the winter, which is around about December, we go to with the College of Islamic Studies in Qatar has been extremely generous, where they host us for 1 week. We just had to get ourselves there. Obviously, COVID has upset all that. But throughout the year for about 13, 14 weeks in 2 semesters, there's a 2.5-hour, 3-hour online seminar. It's a very, very serious seminar that takes place with about a group of 45 participants on every occasion. And it's been extraordinary to see the kind of questions, the way we've been challenged. I've been challenged to think about a whole range of questions, in the issues of theology, the questions of Islamic law, but also the questions about human existence, and the questions of the philosophical. How do we approach the world, and what are the elements that go into that? I do believe, and I want to say it very modestly, that we basically just scratched the surface. There's a lot of learning that goes on here. We are also producing a volume of essays with our partners and some of my former students about how do we think about the question of the theological, and that is something that will come out. So so maybe this would be a good set of preliminary comments that will hopefully have allowed you. Let me just say the following: in terms of contestations, this question of knowledge is also the kind of root question in one way that generates what other speakers have already talked about, the contestation between, in the post 47 period, between Deobandi and Barelvi and Salafi, right? Now obviously there are deeper theological questions. The Deobandis and the Barelvis were in the kind of post-independence period at each other's throats. That has substantially been reduced, I believe. At least that's my observation. They still do, generate polemics against each other, but they go back to certain kind of understandings of the nature of the prophet. Is the prophet, a person in an ordinary sense, or in an extraordinary sense, that the prophet is made out of light, and that's a Barelvi position. That the prophet knows, the ghaib, the unknown, and he's fully aware of that. And the other issue is also, and that the prophet's presence is everywhere. So that is the Barelvi claim, that the prophet is made of nur, made of light. The prophet is hazir nazir, the prophet is presence of the prophet. And the question of ilm ghaib, that the prophet has knowledge of the unseen. And the Deobandis, would admit to some of those issues, but in a less intense way. And there will be varieties amongst the Deobandis and so on and so forth. It reaches a conflictual point over the question of, for instance, the celebration of the prophet's birthday and the way the prophet is saluted, whether you stand or don't stand. And then there's a contestation between, we love the prophet more than you do. You don't love the prophet, you are actually anti-prophet, and that creates conflict. That has substantially subsided. But these debates go back, into the tradition. And I don't think the two sides have found any relevant, deep conversation about how do you understand those issues today, except that they have, put their swords into the scabbard, so to speak, right? And God knows when they're going to take that sword out again, says my skeptical self. And normally these questions come out when there are kind of political contestations in South Asia, in Pakistan. It happens with the whole question of blasphemy issues. And then the Barelvis take the lead, and they push very hard on the question of the full ontological absolute authority of the prophet, that cannot be in any way impugned by any kind of way, and therefore it is the duty of the state and the Muslim community to defend the prophet's integrity at every level, no matter the cost, right? And the Deobandis cannot walk away from that unless they want to lose out big time. And neither can the Salafis, and neither can the Shia, and everybody has to love the prophet, but they love it in a different, they will have their own internal articulations. And similarly, the Barelvi Deobandi on the one side versus the Salafi is basically that the Salafis view, one, they find it very problematic that these two Barelvis and Deobandis, they follow the Hanafi school, with complete loyalty and don't raise any questions about sources and how the possibilities are that their early founders could have got the sources wrong. So the Deobandis and Barelvis accuse the Salafis of being ghair muqallid, that they have abandoned following traditional authority. The Salafis, on the other hand, find the doctrines of both the Deobandis and the Barelvis to be extremely problematic from their point of view. The idea that both of these schools take an element of Wahdatul Wujud very, very seriously, or in different doses of the unity of existence, and the way they understand these questions, their doctrines of Tawheed. The Salafis would sometimes basically say that their doctrines come close to the question of polytheism and shirk. And they have deep problems with the Deobandis and Barelvis internalizing certain practices of tasawwuf, which involves, what they call tasawwur fi sheikh, and bringing your sheikh, your spiritual master into it. The whole question of your relationship with a past a spiritual teacher, those kinds of issues that they find that it's too enchanted to their liking, and that rather the safety is in the quasi literal tradition. Not, I don't think the Salafis are absolutely literal, but they have a kind of a quasi literalist approach, and some of the better ones amongst the Salafis do have are forced to make certain hermeneutical moves in order to accommodate space-time, context, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is that these debates are continuous, and part of the problem, they remain unresolved, or maybe these audiences don't want it resolved. But the people who feel the brunt of these issues are Muslims on the ground, and practitioners on the ground who are drawn into either as cannon fodder for protests where dozens are killed in blasphemy issues, and when passions run high, confrontations with the police, whether it's Salman Rushdie or more recent events in different parts of South Asia, or whether it's about Muslim women looking for certain kind of solutions to a variety of practices. In India, it is Muslim personal law, the triple talaq. In Pakistan, it's also these kind of similar things that are there. In Bangladesh, also similar kinds of questions. But it's also about life, everyday struggles for dignity, um, and the struggle for dignity to eke out an existence where they're hearing a cacophony of voices that are pulling them in different directions. And in India in particular, the question of Muslim development is the number one question. I mean, Muslims are falling behind in all kinds of statistics, and are falling behind even what they call the scheduled classes. Now, is the religion the cause? Not necessarily, but your temperament, your attitude towards coexistence. Are you going to go into a school that is with people with different kinds of religious traditions, or are you going to find yourselves in Islamic schools and Islamic universities, and that kind of mindset from someone who came from South Africa, where I think Muslims, as a very, very small minority, have done quite well. I'm obviously of the opinion that one has to find a modus vivendi to exist, and that modus vivendi cannot just be purely political, but it must also reach into your subjectivity. How are you going to live with the other? And it just cannot come from a pragmatic position, but it must come from a deep understanding of the humanity of the other. And yes, the other sometimes can be extremely barbaric towards you, but you have a duty and an obligation. And so, what is authenticity all about? I'm slowly coming to the idea that it's possibly responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that extraordinary journey that you took us through, both of your lives, through history as well as through philosophical and ideological intellectual currents of our times. I had a number of questions. First of all, I too grew up in not one, but minimally two, if not more, apartheid societies. One was Pakistan. The other one was Saudi Arabia, where I lived for a few years, which Robert Vitalis has shown is, in fact, an apartheid society deliberately created as an apartheid society. And then I, of course, lived in the United States for 17 years, which is not obviously no longer formally apartheid. None of the societies that I'm speaking of would be legally or formally in some. Saudi Arabia probably more so than otherwise. So there's different scales or degrees of apartheid as well, and forms of apartheid. The reason I start with this is because I think a lot of what you have spoken about, it needs to be stated, is in fact a direct result of the historically unprecedented apartheid character of the colonial state, and therefore of this post-colonial. After all, that famous minute on education by Macaulay, the formulation is quite extraordinary and historically unprecedented. He says we want to create a class of people, who are Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and opinions, etc. Even that thought would not have been possible in the past, as if these things could be national. They belong to tastes and opinions were national or civilizational. These were new ideas and peculiar to that apartheid, and they created also deliberately, as the Macaulay minute shows, deliberately created an apartheid society that wasn't just limited to the apartheid between settler and native, as Mahmoud Mamdani calls it, but within the quote-unquote natives also, because of course apartheid is apartheid all the way down. And the other remarkable feature of this apartheid of the colonial state was that even knowledge was organized in an apartheid fashion. So there were, in fact, national or civilizational knowledges that were hierarchical. This is all quite new and peculiar to the colonial condition, because neither, for one thing, the colonial state was a national state. The empires of the past were not national empires, they were dynastic empires. So you had this new national apartheid and also epistemological apartheid. So, and we continue in this society. Dr. Iqbal Ahmed used to say, Pakistan is an apartheid. We have linguistic apartheid in Pakistan. I think it goes well beyond that. That apartheid character literally means that people of our class, you, Sajjad, now, myself also, barely aware of these entire worlds of knowledge, which have been completely ghettoized since colonial times, but continuing into the present. Have been completely ghettoized. They have some popular political manifestations, and somehow they've been incorporated into, state structures like the Federal Sharia Court, for instance, in Pakistan. But nevertheless, this apartheid character of both, which is linguistic, which is epistemological, which is social, in all kinds of ways. So a lot of what the madrasas, the situation that they find themselves in, and the particular kind of conflicts, contestations, and also the anxieties that lead to the kind of withdrawal that you've been talking about, arise from that. So that's one of the questions that I had for the presentation that you made.
Should I wait for the Sajjad, or should I just go, and then maybe I take Sajjad's question afterwards?
No, go ahead, and then.
Okay. Yeah. So yes, in the book I do talk about madrasas as heterotopias, the kind of that breaks away from the nation state utopia and from the dominant utopia to create a separate kind of a space to preservation. Now, obviously, the crisis in the 19th century, when the new incarnation of the kind of late 19th century madrasas were, we don't have very good histories of, madrasas during the various Mughal periods and earlier. We have snapshots and so on, but we don't have decent histories. Um, so, but at least from the 19th century onward, the Deoband model will bring all, have a place. Prior to that, obviously, was Farangi Mahal in Lucknow, which was a kind of a dynastic family outfit. And they did great work and produced great, extraordinary scholars and so on and so forth. But, the one in, so, if you look at the Farangi Mahal school, the Farangi Mahal school kind of, taught generations of people. Some of their major science or science, went to different parts of India. I'm thinking here particularly of Bahrul Ulum, Abdul Ali Bahrul Ulum, who ends up in Chennai, what is today Chennai, in Madras. He's buried there. I like this guy. I write a great story about him, of how he's a kind of an itinerant figure who goes to Madras with about 200-300 students in tow. And prior to that, he was in different parts of West India and North India. But it seems that they were fairly still living under the kind of aura that there's this empire, and this imperial epistemology that they had, that they thought that the Mughals are still around. By as you know, by 1810, the British had taken Delhi, right? I mean, it's game over, so to speak. And but Muslims in India were still living. Some of them were thinking, how do we deal with this new contingency? Shah Waliullah's grandson and his collaborator, Sayyid Ahmad Rai Bareli, and Shah Ismail, they decided jihad is the way to fight the British. Before they got to fight the British, they met their Moses with Ranjit Singh, and and they then found themselves kind of beaten by the superior forces of a regional ruler. Those embers stayed until the Indian uprising against colonial rule, 1857, some of that, and then again, so it's in that space that people like Nanotwe and others believe that there's a question of preservation. And if you've ever been to Deoband and some of his madrasas, these early madrasas, they have very thick walls, about perimeter walls, and it was a kind of a kind of a mindset is about protection of what is ours and avoiding contamination, except that both Nanotwi and Rashid Ahmad Gangoi did study with their teacher Maulana Mamlukul Ali at Delhi College in the vernacular. They took some classes with him in vernacular classes, in vernacular language. Delhi College also had English. And I think that's where they took the bureaucratic organization of how to, the kind of British model. Barbara Metcalf talks about that and so on. But so the question that confronts that constituency, the ulama constituency, largely Sunni constituency, varieties of Sunni, but also I think it applies to Shia and smaller groups like the Dawoodi Bareilwis, Dawoodi Bohras, and the Ismailis on the subcontinent. And that is, how do we keep the same position? Now, there are some madrasas in India, at least in Maharashtra, by a man called Vastanvi, where they've tried to develop, high school, madrasa. You can also go to college and so on, but it's all very much kind of siloed. And the intramural mural conversation that takes place, because exactly as you said about the anxiety of the post-colony and the colonial, and the question of the past, and whether it is dominant hegemonic narratives that are still colonial, and maybe they will be more open to a kind of a decolonial narrative if it is put to them, and how to deal with that. But whether it's colonial or decolonial, whatever, you will have to learn, you will have to acquire the literacy. You see, who can do decolonial? are people who went to modern universities. They do the decolonial because they know what the colonial is. You can't tell a madrasa a student, decolonial. They would say, "D what?" Because you need to you need to tell them, what is the harm in Mill, or the way that Rousseau saw things. What is the question of the nation state? I mean, most of the places, when you look at fatwas that come out of madrasas across the board, even in Arab world, the fatwas look at the modern nation state and its apparatuses in very mechanical ways. It looks at even bioethics in extremely mechanical ways. Okay, you're talking about gene therapy, you're talking about organ transplant. How does it work? Let me give you an answer. Boom, right? It's not the full question of, organ transplantation, by gene therapy. These things have consequences, socio-economic, on the long term. There's no rationale behind that. It is kind of, now, unfortunately, these audiences are also put on the spot. They need to have a quick fix, so they do the fatwas in the best way that they can. They don't even remember Ibn Nujaym saying, the great Egyptian scholar, Ibn Nujaym saying that, you don't only have to have fiqh, of a fiqh al-fatwa, but you need to have fiqh al-fiqh. In other words, you need to understand the big picture of your fiqh judgments and your ethical and juridical rulings. You need to see the unforeseen consequences of that. He says the same thing about fiqh al-qadha. You mustn't just be competent in being a judge, but you need to understand the big picture, the imponderables, which you need to think about. And some people have that kind of qualification and ability to think, and you can't think through those things today unless you have some handle on whatever you think of how these things might do. Future studies is a whole area that people have pondered and thought about, and so on and so forth. So the question here is that, yes, we are labored and burdened with these various inheritances, but we also, and I think this is something we don't often talk about, that our heritage also has been extremely divisive. I mean, in 18th, 19th century until early 20th century, people used to read Mullah Sadra, right? Who was a clearly, Shah Waliullah read Mullah Sadra. He keeps on talking about Shirazi, Qala Sadr Shirazi. Nowadays, people don't read that. There are boundaries that have gone up now. Okay, um, 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 you know, people like Ibn Salah and others, frowned on Ghazali and said, how could Ghazali take, the Greek heritage seriously, and how can he take logic seriously? And said, God forbid, people like, many other scholars said, Ghazali has lost it in a variety of ways, and so on. That is also part of our tradition. So might not be big scale apartheid, but kind of small scale apartheid too. And we need to be open to that kind of inquiry and awareness, and not be, and you see, a part of the kind of decolonial, post-colonial thing is, we don't want to open up our own heritage to critical scrutiny, because we say the other is going to grab it and then criticize us on it. So what? So what? So what? So what? We are a civilization that, can put all our goods out for inspection, and we now at a position that we will say, well, we'll have to make some choices. These are the things that we like, and these are the things that, we're going to say a prayer over it, and put it to bed, and give it a good resting place. So I think this question that you raise is this anxiety. We cannot continuously live in a state of anxiety. And how do we deal with the anxieties, and how do we empower ourselves? So the modern condition does impose a certain kind of what we call agonism, right? You're agonistic, you're neither here nor there. This pulling on your body and your soul, and that is a difficult situation to go through. But Muslims will not be the only people that have gone through this in human history. And I think we are now at the stage that we can have these conversations, and we can, and it's not about, wiping off and say, no, we're going to be anti-tradition. No, it's about, how do you think about, how do you put together the puzzle of tradition for time today. In fact, Walter Minolo would say, don't use the word tradition. Tradition is what modernity has made all other knowledge systems. So talk about the Muslim knowledge system, right? Because of Talal Asad and what's the name, McIntyre, we now talk about tradition, and Talal Asad is very fair. He says modernity is also tradition. These are all knowledge traditions. So let's call it knowledge systems. Africans are struggling with their knowledge systems, the indigenous knowledge traditions. The Chinese are doing that. Everybody. Latin America is a very, very earnest debate about how do we deal with knowledge traditions on the ground that as part of our lived experiences. Muslims are lucky compared to others that we have a memory of our knowledge systems. In Latin America, I mean, you have to go and do ABC, ethnography to figure out how the Quechua and the indigenous people are living, to get an idea, because they didn't have a written tradition, and these traditions have been disrupted. The native Indian tradition on this continent where I am right now are disrupted. I mean, you do have Native American universities and so on, but they're trying to put these things together. They're trying to put their past together. So Muslims are kind of comparative advantage, given that we've had a lived tradition, and this tradition is still living in Muslim bodies, but obviously in a very much in an agonistic sense. And with some, I'm hopeful that and this what gives me really hope is this project, and this project of the Madrasa Discourses, where I see these young people teaching me and making me understand other possibilities of how this tradition can be applied to their lives, and how they can bring about possibilities of human flourishing. Sorry, I took a little bit too long in responding to that, Sajjad.
No, in fact, that's very useful. I mean, again, I have lots of questions and lots of kind of words which jump out. I mean, I guess the most obvious one, going back to this idea of the madrasa as a fortress of ideas that you mentioned earlier, the foundation of the abundant stuff, that obviously arises out of a sense of attack, right? So defense against some sort of attack, which of course is precisely the point that we're making about colonial modernity. But I want to maybe come back to this point that you mentioned about authenticity, right? So I understand this idea of authenticity being about grounding the self, right? Understanding who the self is, understanding the inheritances perhaps of the self in different ways. But also the way in which that self very much works, not just at a local level, but as part of a wider world, right? So it's not about kind of just rooting that self in a particular tradition, but also understanding that, especially nowadays, those traditions cannot be siloed. It's absolutely impossible. We live in a world in which you have so many different kinds of influences. And I guess even madrasa students must have social media. Right? So, because everyone has a smartphone, it's as simple as that. So you can't really kind of cut yourself off from these wider things. So that really then does raise the question of what does it mean to be authentic, within such a context? What sort of formation of the self is involved? And it certainly seems to me that while I take the point about the madrasa tradition being atomistic, of course it is, and it's pretty much in every context, although some are changing more than others. And this is without kind of resorting to nostalgia, but certainly one of the ideas of the madrasa system which was important was this idea of the formation of the self, formation of the ethical self in particular. And, kind of almost ironically, one of the interesting comparisons to that idea is precisely decolonial praxis, right? Really thinking about what is education all about. And another good example is Wael Hallaq's project, right? So Wael Hallaq's project has all become about how do we reintroduce ethics into education, because it seems to have been completely devoid of that, or certainly ethics and the formation of the ethical self have been taken out of that. So I guess I just want to push you a bit more on thinking about this question of authenticity and the question of, really what is the function of this, this institution, this formation, this education as we're moving forward in the in the space of the post-colony, which you mentioned right at the beginning.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a question that we all agonize about, and I don't think I have any answers to your very clear and appropriate questions. But I think that what you are hinting at, and what I seem to have understood, that Muslim societies in the past and the present are heirs to multiple knowledge traditions or knowledge spaces or knowledge systems. And part of their success in the past was to build on existing ones. They did not reinvent the wheel. The problem is that some of these things that we have had, some major kind of projects, global, worldwide, was, to reinvent the wheel, whereas actually we have to the question must be to reinvent knowledge, not the wheel, right? And how do we have, deep conversations about knowledge? So I think when one has, now the question remains, the dilemma that knowledge is not free floating either. Knowledge is anchored in material and historical conditions. And knowledge itself then is built into it, is a design of a way of living, a way of existence. And we are caught in an epoch, and I take the Anthropocene very, very, very seriously. I'm just reading a very important book by Jürgen Renn, The Evolution of Knowledge, from the beginning to the Anthropocene, Renn. It's a very, very fine-grained work, trying to think about these kind of questions about, various ways of epistemological modes of thinking. He takes seriously these questions about, marginalized communities' experiences, and how we deal with those, with the experiences of marginalized communities. And I think that, Muslims too have this opportunity to do this. But you see, I don't think it's going to be extremely successful if it is done in the ICU ward, intensive care unit. You must be able to, breathe and get oxygen from the wider world. Sometimes, when the patient is very sick, you go to the ICU. But otherwise, you need to develop herd immunity, to use a contemporary, what's the name, and you need to be able to develop the capacity to live and breathe the air that everybody else breathes. And so this wider world that you talked about. So I think what I think part of the challenge for the Muslim self is the empowerment of the Muslim self. What we need small success stories. We need small success stories. We want one institute that is an institution of excellence. I'm now thinking very practically. I've seen in my life people talking about, mega projects, and then they all fall flat once the person dies. I want small success stories. I mean, I always tell people, you talk about Pakistan being a basket case, look at the AD Foundation. Okay, look at that. One person makes a contribution and builds something, right? It's a wonderful example, of a social institution, of an NGO that does amazing work all over South Asia, all over the Muslim world. You're going to find some people who are doing really, really meaningful work, from pastoralists to people who are agriculturalists, caring for the self, and so on and so forth. So the picture, unfortunately, the media gives us about the Muslim world is people gone crazy who only know about blasphemy, and they behead teachers' heads who show them pictures, or it's terrorism. And part of this thing is also the leadership of various Muslim countries like these kinds of headlines, because then they can tell their partners in other parts of the world, we are the only guys standing between you and these barbarians. Okay, so keep on sending the money to us. Okay, we keep these people under control. Various kinds of dictatorships in different parts of the world who make all kinds of deals above the heads of their peoples and the hearts of the peoples and over them, and they would fly in if they get them 2 minutes, they will all be off the stage, if their people can get to them. But I'm not here encouraging people to do irresponsible things. I'm just describing a historical condition. So what we need is micro levels of empowerment and success stories and human development. You see, in the madrasa, where ethical formation needs to take place, I'm talking from experience, because of the lack of elementary level of wealth for existence, the absence of that causes a huge ways that the self has to act in irresponsible ways. You understand what I'm saying? I'm trying to put it in a more subtle way. In other words, while the Muslim middle classes and others are lavishly spending wealth in different places, the madrasas basically run the entire school year annual budget and providing kids food and what would be a week's budget in any small college in India and Pakistan, secular college and so on, right? So they are very much kind of Spartan shoestring operations and so on. Now, obviously, it's also become a big business. I'm working at your madrasa. I see that you used to drive a cycle, and then now you're on a motorcycle. Now you're driving a car, and so I also do. I go to the other corner and also open up another madrasa because I can now do fundraising because of that. So all kinds of ethical perversity also comes into that. Not everywhere, but that happens, and we need to be aware of that. What we need to do is that those of us who care about those institutions need to come with a helping hand, and a helping hand is to provide resources, to provide expertise, and to work with them and let them achieve those objectives that they want, and also in the process make them share with them knowledge traditions that they are unfamiliar with in a way that will empower them. And so the self is not only spiritual, but is also shaped by materiality, and the material conditions of many parts of the world that we are talking about doesn't make it easy to live a life of dignity and flourishing. That dignity is, I mean, and the reason why we have different parts of the world, including the United States, I mean, this big resurgence in Europe and North America, you see, of white power and white right-wing activity, is a deficit of dignity. The nation state has overlooked these people. These are the flyover people of America, right? These are these white folks who the tech revolution and everything else has overlooked them. They impoverished, they live from hand to mouth, and they see immigrants like me who come and in, for want of a better word, we have kind of made it, and so on and so forth. And so there's a resentment and so on. So imagine in places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, with this large, sectors that are impoverished. And for those impoverished sectors, the madrasa is the place that gives them the elementary knowledge, right? Not all of them can go to school, and then they get into that bubble and for lifelong stay in that bubble, and that bubble has its own problems. The deficit of dignity is there too. And the deficits of dignity are also at your secular universities and colleges, where everybody is either looking for a job in the government that will be paid and not sure whether the ethical ways of getting that job doesn't really matter, or go to the Gulf or go to outside to get something. That's the search. There must be the possibility why that our people can get dignity in the countries which they are. You must hold the political authorities, hold them responsible, put their feet to the fire. And you just cannot just play around this game. This is a dangerous game that many governments are playing, telling madrasa communities, we are with you, we're going to certify you, and so on and so forth. You have to go beyond certification. You need to provide them with resources. You have to take money away from the military budgets that you're spending trillions of dollars on, and give ordinary people the wherewithal to make a life of dignity. At the end of it, it's all about human dignity. Why are we, I mean, those of us who have had better opportunities and so on, why are we having kind of lives of, let's take it for a minimum, flourishing? Because we are entered into conditions and so on where these things are possible. It's not always possible in the spaces that we are talking about, and also not very possible for many people in Europe and in North America to make it out of it. I mean, West Virginia is, or parts of Indiana and so on, are also in deep spaces of indignity. So this is a global phenomenon. I just don't want to harp on the Muslim world, but since we're talking about the traditions and the knowledge practices of those societies, so. If you want to talk praxis, um, so therefore, I'm now, yes, I can't change the state. I can't go and talk to Imran Khan and tell him do X, Y, and Z. He might say, "Who are you to talk to me?" In the first place. But I can talk to people who want to listen to me at the madrasa, and let's build a community, a small micro community, where we can give those teachers lives of dignity. We can give the students a life of dignity. Small micro stories, 100, that will build, that will. And there are some places like that, experiments in different parts of South Asia, that this is happening. And I think many of the people I speak to, and I speak to them all the time, realize that this is possible. So your answer to the self is not only about the resources of the past, but it's also about the material conditions of the present. Otherwise, that self is going to suffocate. Now, yes, I think Nauman is going to remind me, but that you have to have the way we use the world's resources must also be ethical, and that's what we all are into. So consumption capital, we have to rethink what is the way out of capitalism. Can there be other modes of existence that we don't deplete the earth? These are the bigger questions. But I'm dealing with a small sector, and I know these meta questions are all above me, but I can't deal with the meta questions at the same time. But I try.
Right. So, Sajjad, can I take the next one, or do you
Yes,
have?
yes, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, I didn't mean to suggest that the madrasas are not responsible, but I mean, now you've just addressed it yourself. The fact that they're actually ghettoized. Yeah, they simply do not have the resources. That's one of the things that being in a ghetto means. But it's also a kind of cultural ghetto. I mean, the thing is that people of English speaking classes, they're simply not interested at all in this. I mean, not unlike my colleague, they think, one shelf of a European library is worth all of the knowledges of the past in Sanskrit, Arabic. I think that holds largely true for the linguistic apartheid, the top community that Dr. Iqbal Ahmed talked about. Um, I also wanted to ask you a question about philosophy. Yeah, the place of philosophy. I mean, I think we live in a very non-philosophical age, and I think when Tocqueville went to America in the early 19th century and wrote Democracy in America, he mentioned this. He said the Americans are the most non-philosophical people in the history of the world. Yeah, we don't exactly live in a terribly philosophically given age, and where philosophy even does exist, as Sajjad will remind us, it's not philosophy as a way of life as it used to be. Yeah, so philosophers in the modern academy are dramatically different from philosophers as they might have existed in the past. So in the madrasa itself, by the way, the question that I want to ask you, so it seems to me, so I'm personally a convert to Shiaism myself, and the difference between the madrasa and the hausa, yeah, in terms of also the translation of all of these continental philosophers, for instance, the Foucault, you mentioned Foucault earlier, he's been translated, yeah, in Persian. Sajjad can enlighten us more about how much of that intellectual discourse is part of the Hausa, how much are figures like that read in the Hausa itself, but in the general culture. So that's a very, very dramatic difference if you look at Pakistan, for instance, between Iran and Pakistan. Yeah, this is what I'm thinking of in terms of the translation into the regional languages. You see a really, really particularly impoverished situation in terms of knowledge in not just the madrasa, but in the larger vernacular tradition that is quite different from Iran, for example.
Yes. No, thank you. No, I think one of the things that Muslim societies are so stratified in different places. Let's talk about subcontinent, very stratified, and we have to come to terms with diversity. That there are going to be this diversity, but how do we celebrate diversity, just not tolerate diversity, right? That is the number one question, right? And do not discriminate against people because they are diverse. So you're sitting with a checklist, this cabinet minister, you're going to play the kind of games of representation and so on and so forth that are deeply divided. You have to, and maybe we need to work about that. So I think that the philosophy is really impoverished in the Sunni madrasas of South Asia. And I know a good bit about Iran. Yes, there's a lot going on there in terms of entire libraries and so on and so forth. But that also is only limited to a certain sector of the Iranian clerical groups, and the ulama is not deeply deeply extended, but it is, and Sajjad could correct me here. But there are people who are thinking seriously about those issues. My question is, I wish I can get more of those kinds of conversations, because Abdul Karim Sarushi is a friend of mine, Mohsin Kadivar is a friend of mine. And every time, they talk about, but we have akal, the Iranians talk about akal and so on. I said, yes, akal, but okay, give me a solution to the problem. Okay. And I find all of us are in the same boat. We are all struggling to get with these very, very deep questions. But yes, there is a good literacy, and obviously Iranians have taken to Heidegger a great deal, because Heidegger has some kind of overlap with being and becoming and Mullah Sadra and so on and so forth. So some of that conversation is there. You're right that we are living in a very aphilosophical age, and many people just completely wants to isolate us. I mean, what is the regular kind of narrative you get of ordinary Muslims, or even the learned? Go back to the Quran and Sunnah. Everybody thinks all the answers are ready made. No one wants to think. This is also the rhetoric that comes out of the leadership. And in the past, in 500 years ago, when you had a question, you go to a learned person who will help you think through a question and so on. Now you want to type it in and say, what does the Quran say? What does the Sunnah say? And you want to have a quick Google answer. You want to go to Sheikh Google. Now, I appreciate literature. I appreciate literacy, and everybody, the literacy is good, but we have not provided young Muslims, whether inside the madrasa, outside the madrasa, with the ways of how to navigate complex literacies. So simplex literacies work. What we have is an affliction of simplex literacies. It actually would be an insult to literacy to call it literacy, but it is the mindset, because the number one issue that the Muslim self today is concerned about is about identity. It is not about subjectivity. It's not about the formation of the self, but it's about identity. This kind of more external kind of those issues that I was battling, and the demons I battled with when I entered the subcontinent, or as a juvenile and ill-equipped to deal with those issues. You think those are, but the deeper questions about the soul, about being, about friendship, about love, about wisdom, those kinds of questions are the philosophical questions. And so and part of the things we and here people like Sajjad and others might want to help us, in this decolonial mood. How do we make, philosophy accessible to Muslims? How do we talk about philosophy in everyday terms? you know um I mean, why must, okay, so we throw people with johar and art, substance and what do you call it,
Accident.
Sorry,
Accident.
access, subject and accident, or we talk about mahia, essence and matter, hayula, and so on and so forth. We need to write books about these issues in ways that these come through, and and what is the, how do we think about mahia, essence and existence and wujud and those kind of questions. We throw these big words around, but we can talk about in very, I mean, someone like Marilyn Robinson, for instance, is extremely successful in talking about complex philosophical questions in ways and modalities that ordinary people can understand, right? So, but I'm sure someone is going to remind me, but first you need to make Muslims to be reading communities. Yes, so we need to become reading communities, or there are other modalities of reading, but we need to make these things interesting. We cannot dumb it down. I mean, this idea of dumbing it down is deeply problematic. So, Emerson and Thoreau are great philosophers. Maybe Tocqueville, missed them. And the question, but these are kind of everyday way of philosophy in everyday life. These questions about thinking, for instance, what is understanding? What is fiqh? Fiqhun nafs. These are deeply philosophical questions. Understanding of the self. And so how do we break this down, whether it's from the mosque and the mimbar, or whether it's in the school, high school classroom, or at the madrasa level and so on? Because I can assure you that this group of very smart madrasa students we have, they are kind of, flawed by, now how does someone like Sher Ali, write such a very complicated history about a discussion that we've heard over and over about the Munazara Shahjahanpur, right? This Mabahis Shahjahanpur. We've heard this over and over, and he writes a whole book on it, right? So it because he breaks it down. He's gone through a certain kind of training, where these kinds of questions are, okay, what does this mean? What is the value of that? How do you write your history? Only some very, very good people like Manazir Ahsan Gilani, for instance, who wrote the 2-volume history of Deoband and so on. He's one of those people that could make the turn to the other side by staying a lot more in the kind of orthodox or traditional camp, but he could speak out and bring that tradition with great light. I'm sure there are people in Iran and so on and so forth that are doing that too. I'm thinking of Mujtahid Shabistari. I think about Mohsin Kadivar. um, Kadivar is a good friend of mine, and so on. So we these kind of conversations are vital.
I mean, in our part of the world, a lot of the philosophy was communicated through poetry.
Yes.
Khaja Ghulam Farid, Husne Hakiki, Noor Azal, Tenu Wajib The, Imkan Kahun, and it goes on and on. All these philosophical terms, actually, Mahiya and other philosophical istalahat terminology is replete in that particular kafi.
And we need to. In fact, I'm making myself a pivot to literature. People like Mantur, Ghalib, and so on, because I find greater inspiration there. I mean, writing theology and the relationship of God and to attributes, and what is the nature of God, the way God speaks to me today. I mean, the nature of the universe, the new cosmology in front of us. What is the nature of being a continuously expanding cosmos? That is the reality. If Ibn Sina was here and I kept on reading his books, he would slap me and said, "Are you stupid?" I mean, he would. Of course, he said, "You need to read my books, but you also need to read the stuff, what's going on right now." So I think that is very, very critical that we deal with because what is philosophy? Philosophy is a question, and these are questions about intensities, as Deleuze would put it. Intensities that or concepts are intensities. It's an aggregation of ideas and thoughts that but concepts are also not stable and static. They work for some time, and then you have to replenish them and refurnish them and remake them. And unfortunately, in the institutions that I was taught in the madrasas, there's very much the holding on, and you will all say the need is anxiety, and therefore they did, but they always want to hold on to what is permanent. So the first question I get is, so are we going to rethink Islam? What about the permanent stuff? What about the thawabit? And I said the thawabit stays on its place. Think around the thawabit. Then you might also see the thawabit slightly differently. And I also ask, okay, you talk about thawabit, what are the permanent elements? So some will give me an element of, okay, no ijtihad with the nas. Okay, the Quran, what's that? But the understanding of the Quran, must it be the same way that Suyuti understood it? And there's no ijtihad on a text. I mean, that is a slogan Ijtihad meaning, innovative thinking and thinking through ab initio about a text of the Quran or the or hadith of the Prophet or the statement of the Imam, how to interpret that and so on. There's not just one way of interpreting that. And but some people are saying, no, you can't do, when you have a nas sarih, a clear a statement, you can't do ijtihad. The very idea they're using the Arabic language and you're thinking that itself is a kind of ijtihad. But these are slogans to stop transformation and change. So yes, there's an obsession with permanence and stuff, and I think when we psychoanalyze those communities, it will be about the dangers they see from outside, the threats, and therefore they want to hold on to that. But everybody, we must have being and becoming. There must be not only wujud, but sayruratul wujud, right? And the transformation of being. So that's where I would go. But that's a question of confidence. It's a lack of confidence of dealing with both our tradition and what's the name. You'd be surprised that the some of the people we've had in our program, many of them, as good as they are in the languages and so on, they don't fully understand the tradition either. It's that slice of the tradition that was put in front of them that they know well. And then the rest of it comes as surprise questions. And then it requires a kind of remaking of, first of all, confidence, anxiety, and so on and so forth, and then going forward. Sorry, long question, a long answer.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's many things to follow up, but I'm just also aware of the time. I guess one very small kind of point I'd make is that certainly the way philosophy was studied in, say, the Safavid madrasas or even in the Dars Nizami was very much this notion of a conceptual framework, and sometimes it was also it was for pleasure as well. So if you cannot read, for example, the very many logic texts which are written in India without thinking that people just enjoy doing it. Right, so that pleasure element of it is clearly something which is gone out of a lot of things, and also I think the other point that you mentioned, which and Nauman mentioned, which is extremely important, is the aesthetic. So there was a reason why in the formation of the ethical person people read Sadi. It's a work of literature, or when people were reading works in Arabic grammar and so forth, they were always reading that alongside what were considered to be the best examples of Arabic literature. So it's kind of bringing in the literature and the philosophy, which is there. And also, the conceptual framework is just the conceptual framework. You don't have to, if someone asks you a question, you don't have to talk about the wujud and the mahiyya and properties and so forth. You basically translate that into terms which are understandable. And of course, one way this has happened in Iran in the 20th century was through Kalam Jadid. So Kalam Jadid was extremely influential and successful because it was a particular kind of instrumentalization. It was to say, okay, we've got this philosophical tradition, which seems rather esoteric, but how do we instrumentalize that to deal with the big questions? So that's precisely what Tabatabai was doing. That was precisely what Mutahari was doing. And some of the positions they then came up with strike a lot of people as being extremely radical. So for example, Tabatabai says there's a massive distinction between metaphysical issues, right? And everything else is conceptual. And if it's conceptual, then it's a way in which we make the world which we can change. So pretty much the whole scope of the legal precepts that people live by, he would argue, is conceptual, right? Now, again, to many people, that's shocking. That means that you can pretty much change most of the ahkam on things because there's nothing fixed about them. They're not metaphysical realities. They're moral questions, and moral questions are conceptual, right? And there's many other kinds of examples about that, but the material constraints are important. I'll give you one example of how that material constraint works with respect to both the kind of secular modernity and the tradition. A number of years ago, I visited Lucknow, which was extremely disappointing. at many levels. But one of the things I did was I visited Sultan al-Madaris, which is the first major Shi'i madrasa in Lucknow, was founded by people who were clearly very bright. First thing that strikes you as soon as you go in is this grand old building, but it looks like it's going to fall down any second, right? The walls are crumbling, they haven't been painted, the floors need work. You've got a small bunch of students who look very impoverished. They're from villages in Bihar and UP and certainly other parts of India. They're just surviving. They're just surviving. I asked them about their manuscripts, and they were very reluctant to say anything, but they finally found their Fehris, their catalog, and they gave it to me, and this catalog was falling apart. So I dread to think what the manuscripts are looking like. And then, of course, they were very proud of the fact that they had also embraced modern learning, so they took me to their computer room, right? And you go into the computer room, and this was in 2009. There were about 5 extremely ancient PCs, which were covered in dust and didn't look like they'd actually been used for quite a while. So there's a sense in which, the survival mode becomes more important. And this is precisely why, one of the interesting things, again, coming back to Halak, Halak makes a lot about the waqf, the importance of the waqf as an institution and how people need to go back to this. This place is not going to survive and it's not going to flourish unless it has an endowment. It's just not possible, because they cannot fix the building. They cannot do more than just literally feed their students. They cannot bring in good students. They cannot bring in good teachers without that basic foundation. And then what it also then means is that madrasa, which is in the center of Lucknow, doesn't seem to be at all connected with the wider community in Lucknow. Apart from the fact that maybe 1 or 2 teachers might be people who also preach from the pulpit. So the material conditions are extremely important, and there's no getting away from the fact that a place like Iran is a lot wealthier than a place like Pakistan or India is. Of course they have the similar kind of differentials, but the basic living conditions are very different of a seminary student in one place as opposed to the other. So yeah, I mean that's kind of an anecdote, but I think the main thing I would mention is, yes, this how philosophy actually works as a lived experience, and then how it links to this notion of the aesthetic.
Well, yeah, no, you totally. I 2 things. I also went to the Sultan al-Madaris, and it's basically half a dormitory, and the situation was very, very painful to see. And part of that is also because Islam and Muslims have become part of a political football in India, because Sultan al-Madaris is on a stipend and a government thing from either the UP government, I think UP government, maybe not central government. And so they, even if they want to put together a waqf or endowment or something of that sort, there'll be all kinds of interference and all kinds of red tape and so on. Same thing happens with Dairatul Ma'arif in Hyderabad. Dairatul Ma'arif have not been able to put together. I mean, they used to do amazing printing and so on. The thing has board appointed people. There's some, government subsidies, but that place needs to be, needs new tools, new printing press. They need researchers to do the work. In fact, if they're not going to train the next generation, that those skills of editing and those kinds of things are going to disappear, and it's just going to become another white elephant. So you're absolutely right. And you see, conceptual frameworks and aesthetics, material conditions enable and disable. And maybe one of the things that where some of the work that you are doing and so on would be to possibly think about, what does the post Mutahari, post Tabatabai, Kalam Jadid look like, and what are the conversations that could be had? I was very keen to take my program one summer into Iran, but it just becomes, I mean, it's easier for the Indian and Pakistani students to go, but, as an American institution, the grant is here. There are all kinds of challenges too, but it's possible to bring, say, for instance, someone like Mushtahid Shabistari or somebody, or people that other people, to a venue in Pakistan and India. That'd be much more easier to have that conversation. So we need to have that conversation, and maybe you need to come too. So so there you got
Well,
your invitation.
and don't forget that there are Indian and Pakistani students, and there are some who are actually quite good in
Okay.
in Qom, so
Okay.
they can certainly engage with that as well.
So you should bring them.
Yeah, sure. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
There are lots of questions I have on my mind, but we've gone well over time because this was such a stimulating conversation. So I think we'll thank now Professor Ebrahim Moosa. Thank you so very much for joining us for this scintillating episode of Islam After Colonialism. Sajjad.
Yeah, I was. Thank you from me as well, Ibrahim, and I certainly look forward to actually meeting in person. Maybe we can do this as our end of year conference or something like that. Just to very quickly mention, our last talk this term will be 2 weeks from now, when we will be joined by Layli from King's College London, and she will be talking about Red Islam in South Asia. So we'll be pivoting to something which a lot of people have forgotten about, which is the relationship between the left and communism and Islam, which has important resonances within the colonial and, of course, in the post-colonial.
Well, let me just thank the both of you and your institutions for inviting me, and I really enjoyed this conversation. This has been really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope to see everyone next time.
Khuda Hafiz.
Okay.